Hold on.
You can proceed.
What am I going to begin? Hold on. Okay. So our topic today is ethics and human rights. So I'll be presenting Jessica Willemse as well as Annika Volji. Basically, we're just starting off with the definition. So ethics is moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. With regards to medical ethics, it's the same, just moral principles that govern the practice of medicine. And values are principles of standards of behavior, one's judgment of what is important in life. So your difference between right and wrong. So basically what we're focusing on is the difference between ethics as a whole and your values as an individual. So the meaning, ethics is guidelines for conduct that address questions about morality. So more as a whole, a system or a group where your values or principles, morals that help an individual to judge right versus wrong. So ethics is a system of moral principles, and values is stimuli for thinking. With regards to consistency, ethics is uniform within a profession, and values, it differs from person to person. What it determines, so basically for ethics, it determines what is right and what is wrong in a given situation. Values Sorry about that. And then the aim. So basically ethics, it aims to constrain. This might seem like not right, but actually it's very important because as healthcare professionals, we need to know what are our boundaries as well. And values, it's more like a personal thing to motivate yourself. Okay. So we started off with a little bit of a scenario because we believe when it comes to ethics, it's very well to know the principles and to know the goals, but it's more important to apply it into practice. So this scenario, it involves a 32-year-old female who you can see she's visibly pregnant. She brings her 9-month-old son to the casualty. It is decided that he's to be admitted for a hypoxic pneumonia. At a later stage, his HIV PCR result comes back as positive. You ask her to do a VCT on the mother. So you ask her permission to do a VCT, but she refuses and denies your request. She says that if her partner finds out that she is HIV positive or that the child is HIV positive, he will leave her. So what is your role as a medical practitioner with regards to ethics? So basically, we'll just keep that in the back of our minds while we go through the principles of ethics. So the 4 main principles of ethics are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So autonomy is being self-governing. So it's the patient should be able to make their own decision freely with regards to their healthcare. Within this is the patient's right to withhold consent. And also this is known or considered to be the most important principle in medical ethics. It overrules what the doctor thinks with regards to what the patient believes and thinks is most important for their own healthcare. But this can be overridden if the autonomous action of an individual causes harm to another patient or person. And it does not extend to people who lack the capacity to make decisions. For example, people with an intellectual disability. And then beneficence, it's simply the act of doing good, which is maximizing patient well-being by appropriate care, exercising our clinical judgment, and when looking at what is doing best, consider the physician's judgment as well as the patient's wishes, which is your autonomy. Then non-maleficence, basically first do no harm, which is the first part of the Hippocratic Oath, as we all know. It's also avoid putting patients at risk of avoidable harm or unnecessary harm. And then an important point is that doctors are fallible and we all can make mistakes. We're equally capable of harming as much as we are of helping. And then justice, it's basically fairness, equity, fair allocation of resources, and the same care should be accessible to all patients in similar situations. Now we know in our country that this isn't often what is happening. But we'll talk about that later on in our presentation.
Okay, now we'll talk about human rights. So what are human rights? They are standards that recognize and protect the dignity of all human beings. They govern how humans live in society and with each other, and they govern the relationship one has with the state and the obligations that the state has towards individuals. They're also protected by the law. A very brief history, the global movement of human rights declaration started after World War II between 1939 and 1945. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations Assembly was established in 1948. As we know, South Africa suffered from apartheid, where the basic human rights of the majority of the country were not respected. After 1994, we declared a democracy to protect the human rights of all. Our rights are guaranteed by the country's constitution, which is the supreme law of the country. And our rights are in Chapter 2 of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. As a human being, we are entitled to have our rights respected, promoted, and protected. The three core principles of human rights, they are inalienable. Human rights cannot be taken away from us. They're interdependent. They're all dependent on one another. And equality and non-discrimination. Human rights belong to all people and should be respected without prejudice. This means that there should be no discrimination against nationality, sex, race, age, language, etc. So we split up human rights into 4 groups: basic rights, civil rights, political rights, and socio-economic rights. Our basic rights are, for example, right to equality, right to life, and right to dignity. Civil rights, freedom of religion, freedom of belief and opinion, and freedom of expression. And political rights, right to vote, right to protest, and right to forming and campaigning for a political party. And socioeconomic rights, right to healthcare, right to adequate housing, and right to education. What is the right to health? So we separate this into 2 parts. The first part we like to call AAAQ. Healthcare should be available, accessible, acceptable, and of good quality. So a state must have sufficient quantity of healthcare facilities, goods, and services. They must be physically and financially accessible to everyone. They must be respectful of medical ethics and be culturally appropriate and sensitive to gender and age, and must respect the confidentiality of healthcare users. And they must be medically and scientifically approved and of satisfactory quality. The other part of right to health is securing the underlying or social determinants of health. For example, food security, shelter, water, electricity, and education. As we know, in South Africa, we see the burden of disease affect mostly poverty-stricken areas. And this is where rights being interdependent on each other comes into play. As, for example, those without food security will suffer from malnutrition. Those without education don't know their right to health. Those without shelter can suffer from getting pneumonia, or those in poverty-stricken areas where there's overcrowding can get communicable spread diseases easily, for example, COVID. So now we look at rights of the healthcare user. So a big one for us is consent. A healthcare user has the right to give consent prior to receiving healthcare service. The healthcare user must also understand what they're consenting to. However, the healthcare provider can administer healthcare services without obtaining consent in certain situations. One, the patient is unable to give consent, and such consent is given by a person who is authorized in writing, or the patient is unable to give consent, and such consent is given by a parent, guardian, spouse, or partner. If failure to treat the user will result in serious risk to public health, or a delay in healthcare service may result in death or irreversible damage to the patient, provided they have not refused the service. Other rights is participation in decisions. a patient has the right to participate in any decision affecting his or her health, and confidentiality. All information involving a patient, including information relating to his or her health status, treatment, or stay in the health care facility is confidential. And a person who is in charge of a healthcare establishment that is in possession of a patient's healthcare record must set up some control methods to prevent unauthorized access to those health records. With rights comes responsibilities, and some responsibilities of healthcare providers are to disclose to a healthcare user the status of their health, except in circumstances where there's evidence that disclosing this information would not be in the best interest of the patient, to explain the range of diagnostic procedures and treatment options available to them. This includes benefits, risks, costs, and consequences associated with each option, to obtain consent from the healthcare user before they receive any healthcare service, to explain the user's right to refuse treatment and explanation of the implications and risks of refusal, to use a language that the patient understands, to simplify medical terms according to the patient's level of literacy, and to protect the personal information of the healthcare user, Protection of Personal Information Act. In conclusion, human rights and medical ethics are parallel mechanisms. Human rights deal with the socio-political level of health, and medical ethics deal more with the doctor-patient relationship. Human rights place a duty on the state and on healthcare workers to comply to certain standards. Medical ethics place a duty on individual healthcare workers to comply with parallel standards. The two are complementary, and together they maximize the level of care and appropriate protection available for the patient. South Africa has come a long way in providing greater access to healthcare. However, the public health sector is failing to provide adequate healthcare to a big part of the country, and therefore failing to protect the rights of many. While our country works on trying to narrow the gap between public and private healthcare, we as doctors have the ethical duty to look out and protect our patients as much as possible.
So back to the scenario that we gave earlier. I'm not going to read it again, but basically, what is your role as a medical practitioner with regards to ethics? So what ethical principles come into play in this scenario and how? So with regards to the mother, you think of autonomy as it's her decision with regards to her child, if with regards to herself, if she wants to test, also with regards to if she wants to disclose the information to her child. So basically that falls under her rights as well as her ethics. But in this situation, you the advocate for the child as the clinician. So the rights of the child obviously also supersede. You can't go above the mom's head, basically, yeah. But it is important, and also something else to consider is that she's pregnant. So the second child also has to come into consideration. So what you can do, you can sit her down, speak to her nicely, have an open conversation with regards to why she doesn't want to test. And if she has tested before, maybe she already knew previously that she is HIV positive. And then you can say to her, don't threaten. Sometimes threats are necessary, but only as a last resort. But you can say to her that the father or her partner, if he is the legal guardian of the child who's admitted, you as a healthcare professional do have the right or the responsibility to disclose the child's status to the father, especially if the mom is refusing to start the child on treatment or is saying that she doesn't want her child to be on ARVs. So also looking at the ethical principles, beneficence to first, non-maleficence to first do no harm. So obviously, you don't want the child to go home without being initiated on ARVs, and beneficence to do good above all else. So in this case, the autonomy of the mother is actually overridden by the fact that there are two other lives in consideration. So yeah. Let's go to a second scenario. Classic Jehovah's Witness. An 8-year-old child of Jehovah's Witness faith requires a blood transfusion as a matter of urgency in order to save his or her life. It is 9 p.m. at night, and you cannot get hold of the emergency contacts, which are the parents, telephonically. It is explicitly stated in the file that the parents refuse to give the child blood transfusions due to the religion that they practice. What ethical principles and rights are you infringing by giving the child blood? So you're obviously infringing the autonomy of the parents, as well as their right to practice their own religion. But in this situation, you'd also have to look at the right of the child and first do no harm. So if this had to go to court, basically, what have you done as a healthcare professional to make sure that this child stays alive, especially if it is a situation like this where it's a life-threatening situation? As a junior doctor, what we would do as our approach is to obviously escalate this as far as possible. If you really have tried and you can't get hold of the parents, you would escalate this to your senior and then to your consultant and then even to the directors of the hospital who are on duty. And then once all of this is done, and hopefully they've approved it either telephonically or in writing, then you can go ahead and give the transfusion. The next day, you'd have to explain to the parents why you made this decision. So then also, lastly, we gave a few tips to assist medical practitioners in a difficult ethical situation. So firstly, be prepared. In the case of a Jehovah's Witness, no other options besides blood transfusion that you could give, and know the case, research the topic, know your patient well. Secondly, honesty is the best policy. Explain to the parents very openly that if you need to transfuse this child and what the risks will be if the child does not receive blood, for instance, in this scenario. And then thirdly, have a face-to-face conversation. It's always better to sit down and to speak in person, obviously preferably in a private setting. And then a patient's next of kin should be present, at least one other person, so that when you're explaining to the patient, their family can also understand the situation. And then point number 5, phone a friend. So ensure that a senior colleague is with you. Also, what's recommended is for a social worker to also be in the situation so that they can explain from a more social point of view, especially if there are socioeconomic issues with regards to the situation, as well as the professional nurse. And then number 6, it's quite an important point. Do not apologize, especially if it's not necessary for you to apologize, because a patient may view your apology as admission of fault. And then number 7, be flexible. So like I said, explore other options that are more suitable or favorable to the patient and their views or beliefs. Like you can suggest that the mother donates blood if the mother and the child are a match, so that you can transfuse the child with the mother's blood if possible. And then number 8, stay calm. Even if the patient or family becomes aggressive, which is something that we often see in our high pressure setting, it's important that you don't react the same way to how you are being approached if it is an aggressive situation. Here are our references. Thank you very much for listening.
No, thank you. Well done. I think those tips are really useful. Just to remind everyone that these are important challenges. There's no rights and wrongs, absolute rights and wrongs in ethical challenges that you experience in practice. What you need to do is to find ways in which you can argue the case. Important to remember that the ultimate argument of your case is going to be in a court. So the first thing you need to do is be familiar with the legal arguments or the legal challenges. So know your laws, particularly I think in this instance or many instances to Child Care Act as well as the Termination of Pregnancy Act. Those are ones that confuse people considerably, the National Health Act sometimes. And then I think when you don't have a clear direction from law, then you need to be using the ethical guidelines that we just talked of from the HBCSA. And those are your important reference points. And then lastly, and I think that's a very useful tip, is ultimately your behavior, your choices, ethical choices are going to be judged based on your peers. So knowing what your colleagues would do is a very important departure point. So getting advice from colleagues is also quite handy.